tardes, bienvenido.
Good afternoon and welcome to this press conference of the International Monetary Fund on the regional economic outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean. I am from the Communications Department and I'm here with Alejandro Werner, who is the Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the International Monetary Fund. Alejandro will provide us with a brief introduction and then we will take your questions. For those who are connected, you can send your questions through the Press Center, and you can also connect through WebEx. We have a blog that is under embargo as part of this press event, and this will contain information mentioned by Alejandro. But the embargo is now lifted, and after these introductory comments, I call on Alejandro. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for being with us. And as we say in the blog, the recovery of growth in Latin America and the Caribbean in the second half of 2020 was quite dynamic. However, obviously, that dynamism fell short of what was present in the world economy and other emerging markets. What is behind this economic recovery? I would say that, first of all, economies have adjusted. They modified the way in which they were operating so as to basically be able to continue to operate while the social distancing measures and the lockdown were in place. Also, we saw an implementation of public policy. We saw stronger policy response than what had been originally foreseen for Latin America in both the fiscal and monetary spaces. And third, the stimulus to the global economy, especially in advanced economies, created important spillover effects affecting Latin America through commodity prices, through remittances, and also through a greater dynamism in manufacturing exports as well as commodity prices. That's something I already said. However, the persistence of the health crisis in many countries has cast a shadow on the possibility of a recovery in the short term, affecting both people and the economies. They both need support. As we have said in our documents, they need a shot. They need an injection so as to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And then there are different underlying fragilities that represent challenges for the long term. Before the pandemic, Latin America was already growing more slowly than in any other region, and post-pandemic, Latin America will be facing higher debt, greater poverty, and educational problems that have accrued during the months of the pandemic. And also, there has been a destruction of operational capital in the business sector, and that will represent a problem during recovery. The 7% contraction in economic terms in Latin America in 2020 was the strongest in the world, exceeding the 3.3 contraction that affected the global economy. And for 2021, we foresee a recovery of 4.6. Latin America at the end of 2021 will not have recovered the economic activity level pre-pandemic. For the emerging economies, without taking into account China, we are forecasting a 5.8% recovery. China will grow at a rate of around 8%, so Latin America will be recovering more slowly than the average of the economies of the region. And the per capita GDP will not get back to pre-pandemic levels before 2024. So this summarizes the major challenges faced by the region, especially in a year where we are seeing a significant recovery. Obviously, all of these forecasts are characterized by uncertainty that is greater than ever before. because to understand how an economy was operating during the pandemic, we're lacking information. We don't have the ability to project or to anticipate what the performance of Latin America's economies will be like. Also, in many countries of the region, we continue to see an intensification, a resurgence in the pandemic. So it's going to be important to continue to take measures of public health so as to stop transmission of the disease. And also, it's important for us to accelerate the vaccination campaigns in 2021. Likewise, the increase in international interest rates is another important risk factor for the region. To date, the hike that we have seen in the 10-year interest rate in the United States has had only a moderate effect, and it has been managed appropriately. But as these factors become more intense, we could see greater financial volatility in the region, and this would obviously be a risk factor that could constrain the economic recovery that we're seeing. But we think that our forecast of 4.6 is obviously based on the dynamic we see in the economy. And as I already said, economies continue to learn how to operate despite the pandemic. We hope that the vaccination campaigns will gain speed during the rest of the year, and that will help reopen the economies in the region. And as I said, with a growth of 6.5% of the United States in 2021, China growing at 8%, the high commodity prices, all of that is the international context that is favorable to recovery of Latin America's economies. Obviously, within the labor market, although 2/3 of the jobs lost have been regained, this remaining 1/3 continues to be a very important number of workers in both the formal and informal sectors. And even greater problematic is the fact that these unemployed are the people with the lowest level of education, the people that have the fewest resources to deal with this long-term unemployment. The same can be said about poverty. We feel that in 2021, the population in poverty in Latin America may increase by almost 20 million people compared to the level in 2019. Although it is difficult to estimate the losses in the medium term, the loss of weeks of education, loss of schooling of boys and girls in Latin America between the ages of 10 and 19, we see that in Latin America, the weeks that schools were closed down, either partially or totally, that number of weeks was the highest in the world. So the cost in terms of future income for children and adolescents that are currently in school will be significant. And in that connection, in the next few months, an important challenge for the region will be to implement measures that can partially offset that educational loss that was caused by the pandemic. That is going to have a bearing on future income distribution because that lack of education especially affected the low-income children. They have less interconnectivity, so they have more limited access to education at a distance. Now, in fiscal and monetary terms, we think that during 2021, those economies that have fiscal space should continue to maintain a significant stimulus level, probably less than what was provided in 2020, because, as we said before, there is recovery in employment and economic activity, but we still, nonetheless, are below the employment and activity levels that we had in the previous year. So it is important to maintain stimulus in the monetary sphere. Central banks can continue to maintain their stimulus in place. The interest rates will continue to be lower than the equilibrium interest rates. So central banks will continue to provide monetary stimulus to the economy, and in some cases also a financial stimulus by growing their balance sheets to support the financial sector and to support the proper functioning of the bond markets. That is what occurred in 2020. And then another point. The economies of Latin America are going to have to cope with an important medium-term fiscal challenge because we're going to come out of the pandemic with significantly higher debt levels than what we had pre-pandemic. And this obviously will make these economies more vulnerable to changes in either domestic or international interest rates, and hence the importance of sending clear signals. After the current economic emergency, it has to be said that the measures will be taken so that we can reach sustainable debt to GDP levels. That is an important point made in the blog, and we've also mentioned it in some articles that my department has published. And currently, the challenge for fiscal policy is how can we continue to support economic recovery and those that were most affected by the pandemic in 2020, 2021, but at the same time send a clear signal of how we're going to normalize public finance once we get through the pandemic. So with that, I come to the end of my initial remarks, and I am available for your questions and your comments. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. We have questions online from Mexico. Silvia Rodriguez from El Milenio has two questions for you. In March, the general inflation in Mexico was 4.67%, above the upper limit established by the central bank. How is this going to affect economic recovery? How does it affect the implementation of policy? And then the expectation of higher inflation in the United States has led to an increase in interest rates. In view of this situation, what are the risks for Mexico, and how can those risks be controlled? And also from Yolanda Morales, Economista, does the Mexican government, has it been working with the IMF to use a flexible line of credit, and can it be used to support public finance? Inflation in Mexico and in other countries of Latin America in the second quarter of 2021 and also in advanced economies is going to show an uptick. And that increase basically is a reflection of the low price levels in the second quarter of 2020. Because when the pandemic hit, an important element was commodity prices. Also, there was a drop in the price of services. There was a big drop-off in economic activity in the second quarter of 2020, and that created artificially low price levels. So if we compare the prices of the second quarter of 2021 with the second quarter of 2020, we can see that increase in the inflation rate. And this will turn around in subsequent quarters, and the levels of inflation will return to normal. They will approach a level that is more in keeping with a situation where there is plenty of room for maneuver because the economies will be performing significantly below their potential. However, the important job for the central bank is to keep these temporary increases in inflation feeding into medium-term inflation expectations, because that would affect price formation policies, and it makes it harder for inflation to go back to its target level. Central banks in Latin America, especially those that have inflation targeting and also flexible exchange rates, they have been quite effective in managing these temporary spikes in inflation, and they really do not require any special reaction of interest rate to deal with these transitory increases in inflation. That in contrast to Brazil, where the medium-term expectation has gone up in part reacting to other factors. In countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, there the medium-term inflation expectations for 2023, 2024 really have not fluctuated much. But these transitory shocks are a challenge for central banks, and central banks have to closely monitor them. Now, regarding an increase in interest rates in the United States, as I said, to date, this has not been a significant problem. The exchange floating systems and inflation targets have been adequate to manage this, but if these phenomena become more marked, there could be a decrease in capital flows to the region. That would mean volatility in rates, prices for other assets, especially exchange rates, and that could complicate macroeconomic management. But we see that Latin America really does not have any major imbalances in terms of assets and liabilities of corporations in terms of their currency. It's not that they have liabilities in dollars and they do not have the resources to pay for those liabilities. That happened some years ago. And also the central banks have a high reserve levels, and some of them are complemented with contingent lines of credit. So I think that the central banks in the region do have the necessary tools. However, it is clear that an important increase in the short-term interest exchange rate would make things more complicated. And there's obviously the potential to limit the economic recovery that we're seeing of the 4.6% growth for this year. Then regarding the flexible line of credit, to date, we have not engaged in a dialogue, nor have we received a request or an expression of interest in using a flexible line of credit. We have not heard from the authorities in Mexico. But the Secretary of Finance of Mexico, in speaking to local members of the press, says that this is something they have considered and will continue to consider. So I would refer to Colombia. Colombia used about 1/3 of its line of credit, basically so that the fiscal authorities would pressure markets less by issuing bonds. So they used part of the line of credit to finance the increase in the deficit in 2020. That was what the fiscal authorities in Colombia did through their debt management office. We consider that that was good use. It was a preventive use. They do have very good access to financial markets, but it served to send a signal saying that they were not going to rely only on markets and that they have these contingent mechanisms. And it would seem that there would be no better time than a pandemic and the drop in global GDP, which is the largest that we have seen for decades. So in doing so, Colombia created no negative effects on the markets. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you. We have a number of colleagues through WebEx, Matos, Liliana Franco from Argentina. If you have questions, please let me know. Let's begin with Martin and then Rafael, if that suits you. Hi, good afternoon. And thank you, Maria. Thank you, Alejandro. I had two questions with regard to Argentina. One harks back to what the WIO pointed out last week and in previous press conferences. We know that Argentina has a high rate of inflation, and it's important that it be rooted in a number of appropriate economic policies. We now have data from March, which will show about plus 4%. What about your thoughts? Are you worried about the inflation rate in Argentina? Do you think it might kick off to higher levels? And yesterday, we learned about an additional set of restrictions, that is lockdowns in and around the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires and a couple of other places. And what are your thoughts in that regard, particularly as to the impact on schooling? Might this not somehow slow down Argentina's recovery? Thank you very much. Let me take a couple of other questions from Argentine colleagues. Liliana, please go ahead. Thank you. Well, I wanted, and hi, Alejandro, hi, Maria, thanks very much. Can you hear me, I hope? Yes, go right ahead. I wanted to hark back to the points made by Kamoto on the question of SDRs that could be used to pay certain loan segments. Can they be? Could you speak a little bit, Alejandro, to that in terms of financing reserves and lowering the fiscal cost in the case of Colombia? But in that case, could Argentina not be able also to use its SDRs in order to pay back the fund for loan payback? Thank you very much. Anything else? Rafael? Thank you, Maria. Alejandro, hi. One more question here with regard to the exchange of views between the IMF staff and Argentina. The idea is that an agreement might be in place between now and the end of the year. But let me ask you, what would be the putative cost to prolonging those talks, cost to Argentina if it goes beyond the end of the year? I saw somebody raising a hand, but I wasn't sure. The image got lost in cyberspace. Who is it? Yes, can you hear me? Yes, go ahead. Yes. Paula Algunes, yes. My question, good afternoon, is the following. Last week, Alejandro, I believe you mentioned in one particular exchange that there was some uncertainty on the side of the Argentinian government as to allies, partners in governmental action. Could you tell us a little bit more, explain a little bit more? Is there a risk there, as you suggested? And how would that bear on exchanges with the fund? And on the other hand, inasmuch as the idea has been floated that an arrangement with the fund might be put off till after the elections, is that something creditworthy, or are these just rumors? We have a couple of questions that Alejandro has noted down, and well, the answers will come later. I'm Alejandro Gonzalez. I have a specific question on capital controls. In meetings that the Minister of the Economy, Mr. Guzman, has had, he has mentioned this with regard to Europe. But the specific question is this. The ex-board representative for Brazil and Argentina mentioned the fact that it had been the question that the Argentinian government was going to impose capital controls. At some point that was mentioned and it was targeted. Is that the case? And secondly, what would or should be the position of Argentina with regard to capital controls? What would you have to say in that regard? Thanks in advance. Well, the last question is the easiest. Let me tell you, we never divulge what was said, either with past or present civil servants, representatives of Argentina. We don't say what we said or what they said. What was decided is published. Of course, there were debates. A debate posits back and forth and various views, but you may be absolutely certain we would never divulge who said what. That won't happen. Nor are we going to discuss or make reference to ongoing exchanges. As to the question that Paula asked, but let me turn to this. As to difference of opinions in the coalition, basically, we were in a particular conference and we're commenting on what we had read. What we had read, which you had published. So it was a comment as to what the Argentinian press was reporting, not what we were saying, and certainly not what we are exchanging in terms of views with the Ministry of the Economy. That exchange is very positive. It is forward-looking. It is concrete. And as I've said earlier, the idea here is to facilitate the arrival at an agreement with Argentina when Argentina deems it appropriate. Argentina will call that. And this takes me to the point made by Rafael, which went to how much we have moved forward technically. I can tell you that we're moving ahead. We do have a basic understanding as to the platform on which we can build and move forward as and when Argentina decides that that is appropriate. Do we know when? I can assure you the cards are in and the ball is in the government's court. They will know when and in what particular context a decision will be ripe for the taking. I could absolutely not pre-guess when that might be. As to the statements of Jeffrey Okamoto, I'd like to review exactly what he read, and I certainly don't want to confuse the public and have it reported, well, Alejandro says X and Jeffrey says Y. Not going to happen. As to the question of whether the SDRs can complement the international reserves, as always, well, that's an issue, but I would have to look very closely at what question specifically was put to Jeffrey and what was his answer. And we'll be glad to get back to you, Liliana, with a clear answer when I have it. As to the ongoing exchanges with the Argentinian government, as we have said constantly over the last 4 or 5 years, an economy with high levels of inflation is worrisome in the long run. And is it high in Argentina? The answer is yes. It has been high for the last 4 years. It's important to bring it down. How do we do that? Well, it's on the basis of a macroeconomic framework and policies that will foster a lower level of inflation, and to do so in a coordinated fashion so that expectations also see that coming. By that, I mean a lower level of inflation. And that is very much the crux of our ongoing exchanges with the Argentinian Minister of Finance. And we speak of coordination and expectations so that we can hopefully see soon a set of policies from Argentina that will foster that lower inflation, that will facilitate it. And obviously, that will also make it easier for the financial sector to be more stable, that interest rates will drop, which will in turn facilitate investment and the generation of employment. Now, with regard to social distancing and the various measures that were made yesterday in that regard, we had felt that the levels of contagion and the high level of contagion, as we've seen it in the first months of the year in not only Argentina but elsewhere in the region, is higher, is worse than what we had expected. Argentina, it would appear, has adapted better than we had expected to the distancing that is essential to curbing the spread of the pandemic. But to what extent this spike is affecting the economy in Argentina and the rest of the region, well, obviously, the risk is to a downward trend in terms of our economic forecasts. But let's be prudent. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's not imagine that the prognosis is X or Y. We've got to see it as it evolves. And we have seen that in the advanced economies, in the emergent economies, and even those with lower incomes have all adapted better to the pandemic than we had first expected. And so how economic activity reacts to economic mobility was strong last trimester. Then it began to be a little less intense as the economies adapted. So we've got to see how we go with this new wave, this new spike, with prudential measures, and take a look at what the economy is looking like in the next couple of weeks. And we will have to see it before we call it. It would be premature for us to do anything different at this point. And I do apologize for the immediate response that Maria and I had as going first to Mexico and then to Argentina. That speaks to our personal bias, and I apologize on both of our behalves. Thank you, Alejandro, says Maria. We have a question from Eric and Martin from Bloomberg, again on WebEx. Interpreter regrets we cannot hear the question at all. Sorry. Can't hear the speaker at all. The interpreter regrets it is still quite impossible to hear the speaker. It would help if you got a little closer to the mic, says Alejandro. There's a great deal of interference. The interpreter regrets it's simply not possible even to try. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Badly, the interpreter points out. No, the interpreter regrets it is impossible to convey the question. It is interrupted. It is choppy. There's a great buzz. I do regret I can't even try. Are you talking about Ecuador, Eric? The interpreter regrets I cannot hear what the speaker is saying.
Disculpa, ¿se habrá alguna modificación o con Costa Rica, el donde queda ese proceso?
Ok, no te podemos oír nada, pero digo, con respecto a Ecuador, claramente, como hemos dicho en otros...
Respect to Ecuador, because we could not hear you at all, says Alejandro to the speaker. Our teams have worked very closely with the current government in Ecuador. We are now looking at the second revision, and we were hoping, of course, to have the results of the elections come in. When the team of the president-elect is ready to interact with the IMF teams, we will, of course, be ready to do so. And at that point, we will hear each other's viewpoints. The president-elect team is well aware of our relations with President Lenín Moreno, the present government, and we've been in touch with all of the teams vying for election, with Guillermo Lazos, etc. We've had contact with him for some time. He had been a candidate, a strong political strength, and our teams always speak to members of the opposition with Guillermo Lasso inter alia, so that we could begin work when we would be ready to do so on the basis of strong common ground. Now, as to Costa Rica, the program has been approved by our board of directors, and we are now expecting it to be approved by the National Assembly. The National Assembly has that on its calendar. It will be taken up soon, we expect, with a positive resolution there too, and once the Assembly gives the green light, we would expect it would be implemented fairly promptly. But it is now in the hands of the legislative in Costa Rica. The board of directors of the IMF has already approved it. Thank you, Alejandro. We have now a question from Peru of La Gestión. who asks, we see that GDP will grow by about 8.5% if in the first quarter the second wave of COVID was controlled. Alas, that has not been the case. So how do you see things now?
I would say that the forecast for Peru on the part of our team is probably one of the most conservative forecasts that have been made, because basically in the first quarter, the estimate was that it would be quite poor because of the extension of the pandemic. So I think that the prognosis wouldn't change all that much. I would continue to think that we probably have a higher probability of the forecast being improved upon, especially because of that big drop in Peru. In 2020, they finished the year with a dynamic economy. So I imagine that once the current contagion is contained, we will see an important reaction. Also, the price of metals helps the economic recovery. So my feeling is that even now that the pandemic has worsened in Peru, there's that resurgence, I would say that the forecast of 8.5% growth is a forecast. But I think that there is leeway there to adapt to negative events like this one. And I think we will continue to see an important recovery. Remember that last year, Peru had a contraction of 11%, and that explains why for 2021 we're expecting such a high rate of growth. So I continue to think that we are going to reach this number in terms of activity and perhaps even a bit higher. Thank you, Alejandro. And with that, we can go to Chile. Montserrat Toledo from Diario Financiero and Berlurius from Mercurio. They're saying, do you think that the idea of using severance pay insurance as a measure? And then Matios Berrios asked another question, one about growth for 2021 in Chile is the vaccination, but the contagion rates show that 90% of the population is still in lockdown. Could they lower the growth projections in view of that circumstance? And there is a question about social assistance. Chile can do more in terms of social support. Do you think the government should be providing more assistance than what has been announced? I would say that our team, the analysis that our economist has done regarding Chile, say that the level of support that is already included in the budget for 2021 is suitable, it's appropriate. So in that connection, we think that the support in 2020 and the support that is expected in 2021 is within the ranges. It is where our economists feel that the problems that are most pressing are being addressed and that there is support in terms of aggregate demand that is sufficient so as to see a dynamic recovery of the economy. Chile, in keeping with our forecast, would be the first economy in Latin America to show a level of GDP production higher than 2019, and that's expected for 2021. So in that connection, under the already announced policies, we think that Chile's performance is going to be suitable and that our teams do not think it advisable to do much more now. Then to do that through a second withdrawal of pension funds, first of all, we don't think it's necessary, and second, that wouldn't be the right vehicle. To continue to deteriorate a structural factor in the pension system in Chile when it's not necessary. And then second, Chile has mechanisms. If it were necessary to do something to provide the population with more support, it wouldn't have to be done by creating the institutional cost, the medium-term cost that this would create for the pension funds, because you would be decapitalizing individual accounts of many persons. And it would be focused, because the families that are doing the withdrawals may not be the ones needing those resources. So definitely, first of all, you have to see if this is necessary, and second, you would have to use the best possible mechanism, and this may not be it. Now, in terms of the severance fund, the severance fund should be used for the purposes for which it was designed. And if there are any structural reforms that would make sense, that's something else entirely. But just to use those resources to continue to expand the support given to the population, now, if you think that's necessary, it would be better to design an appropriate program that would address those programs that are creating that greater demand for support, and find the budgetary resources to be applied to accomplish that purpose. And Chile has the fiscal space to do so. In the past, we have been clear regarding not affecting structural issues, things like pensions or severance funds, for other purposes, especially in an economy that does have the space and that has the institutional framework, the governance, so as to implement specific programs to address pandemic-related issues, something that would be temporary, limited, and funded out of the budget, which is the way you should fund these programs. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. Now we have a question from Ricardo Leopoldo from Agencia Estado, and it's in English.
To Brazilian economy in the short run, with fiscal problems, about uncertainties regarding the compliance of the federal expenditure ceiling and very slow vaccination. Are you afraid that the recovery in Brazil is going to be too slow this year, that it would have an important social and economic effect for the country next year?
Look, we already have a slow recovery expected for the Brazilian economy. We're expecting Brazil to grow at around 3.7, significantly below, the number that it's above 6% in the case of Chile, around 5% for Colombia, Mexico, 5% around Colombia and Mexico, and as I said, 8.5 for the case of Peru. However, Chile is among the largest economies in Latin America, the one that contracted the least in 2020, thanks to a great extent to the important fiscal response that the government put in motion, and also thanks to the pretty good and impressive behavior of its exports. So, in that way, when we judge where GDP is going to end up after 2021, Brazil will not look that bad compared to other countries in Latin America. Maybe Chile will be the first one that catches up to pre-pandemic GDP, and maybe Brazil will be slightly after that. Definitely, the fiscal challenges that Brazil faces with a very high level of debt to GDP, together with a very large public sector deficit in 2020, it's behind also the slower growth in 2021, because Brazil is basically withdrawing this very large fiscal impulse that put in place in 2020. And part of this withdrawal, it's because, given its financial constraints and the high level of debt, there's a big concern in Brazil that the continuation of these supports at a very high level might risk financial instability, and this financial instability will actually have a negative effect that will be even larger than the positive direct effect from the support. So, it is in a challenging, Brazil is in a challenging situation, is trying to manage this trade-off, and I think it's basically doing it in an effective way. The Congress and the government decided to do a small augmentation of support by extending the cash transfers to the most affected families at a lower level for a given period of time. And there are also important negotiations to send very clear signals that I mean the important fiscal framework that provides a medium-term anchor to debt sustainability is strengthened in Brazil. I think that's a little bit the right combination, but obviously, given that it's taking place in an economy that has important financial challenges, and from the public health side is confronting a very complex situation, it is more risky than other countries, but I think they're handling it right. Regarding vaccination, it is true that there have been some problems, but I mean, when we judge vis-a-vis other countries in Latin America, I mean, I think Brazil is close to the upper tiers of countries with respects to vaccination. Obviously, we have Chile, that it's a world apart from the rest of the countries, with more than 0.5% of the population having received more than one dose, having received at least one dose, and Brazil is kind of the second pack, in which, I mean, you have Brazil, then maybe you have Uruguay, obviously you have Barbados, and then you have the second pack where you find Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, where ratios of the population that have received at least one dose are in the range between 12 and 8%. No? And that's where Brazil is, and I think it's very important for Brazil, obviously, to step up the pace of vaccination, but it has faced, I mean, similar challenges to the ones that we have seen in other countries of the regions and in many EMs.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Estamos quedándonos.
Thank you, Alejandro. We are short on time, but let me read one more question. It comes from Keith Royston Cloister, the Jamaica Observer.
For countries like Jamaica, which were about to go below a debt-to-GDP ratio of 90%, but wholly due to the 10% decline in GDP, are now around 100% again. Should we target a balanced budget, or should we seek to provide a small stimulus to our productive sector and the poorest as the pandemic continues?
Look, as I said before, it's a difficult balancing act. I think economies, I mean, and obviously tourism-dependent economies in the Caribbean, I mean, Jamaica is not as concentrated in tourism like others, but obviously it's still, I mean, tourism represents an important part of its economy. It's a balancing act between continuing to provide support that will be needed, but without triggering financial concerns. And I think that's what the government of Jamaica has been doing. It has been doing it well, but we all have to accept that it's a difficult balancing act, because sometimes if you go too far in terms of support and that triggers a negative reaction to capital markets, then all the good work that you can do with the support gets undone by the volatility that capital markets generate. We also think that in many of these cases, I mean, the new allocation of special drawing rights, if eventually it's instituted, will be a positive element to increase the firepower of authorities to manage these trade-offs, and will also bias the decision towards being able to be a little bit more supportive, because you know you have the instruments in case volatility heightens up, that you have a much stronger balance sheet at the central bank. So I think in the case of Jamaica, that's as for all the countries in the region, that will be a positive addition to the arsenal of tools that they can use to manage this pandemic, and will allow them to be a little bit more forward-leaning in terms of supporting their economy. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Con esto damos.
Thank you, Alejandro. This brings us to the end of our press conference. I wanted to thank all of you for having joined us today. We are going to try to answer some questions on a bilateral basis, so enjoy the rest of your day and stay healthy. Thank you.